Labor Talks was John DeRosier, recorded at Chippewa Valley Community Television in Eau Claire, Wisconsin.
Good day and welcome to Labor Talks. Today's very special guest is Bruce Willett. He will be 90 years old in about 3 weeks and he's still going strong. As a matter of fact, Bruce is running circles around me. Now, Bruce is the former chair of the Eau Claire County Board and he currently represents District 20 on the Eau Claire County Board. He has served on the administrative committee and he still has a strong interest in conservation and environment. Bruce, welcome to Labor Talks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. And how long have you served on the county board?
Well, first I want to thank you for having this time to present some issues, and also I want to thank the people of Washington, town of Washington, who have put up with me for 19 years, and thought I might represent them well, and I tried to do that. So 19 years to answer your question.
And why did you first get on the county board?
Well, I worked for 3 different counties before moving to Eau Claire, county boards, as an employee. And I found the opinions that I had were not exactly the same as the county board often represented. I was very much people-oriented, and sometimes I felt that what was important to the county board was to consider the dollar before people. That was one reason. The other reason is that I know that when you get older, you better keep busy or you don't last long. So I'm still busy, hoping I'll last a bit longer.
So do I. Now, in all your years of experience in public service, have you had much contact with unions, and if so, please describe your experiences.
Well, I didn't have an awful lot, but at 2 of the counties where I was working, these employees wanted to have a union, and I kept saying, oh no, the county board will take care of you. They'll give you a cost of living rise. I was wrong, but and I had to admit it to the employees that was my mistake. I overestimated the care that the county board had for their employees. And I find generally the county employees are very dependable and giving people, so I was a bit disappointed with myself. But the unions came in anyhow, so in spite of me. But I was glad they did as I look back on it.
So you learned a thing or two about unions.
I did. I did.
Okay. And what, in your opinion, and you just touched on it as far as wages are concerned, but what, in your opinion, have unions done for this area and the state of Wisconsin?
Well, generally there's some major things that were accomplished, such as unemployment compensation and compensation for any injury and so forth. Those were never considered until the unions got organized. And I think basically the unions brought about the idea that any production ought to be a cooperative thing between the administration and the workers. So that sense of community was very important to a lot of people in this area, and particularly in the northwest part of the state where there was quite a strong Finnish influence. In fact, today I shop at a grocery store and a hardware where I have to give them a little number, and every year I get a few bucks because I'm part of a cooperative venture where administration does work with the employees.
Don't stop now, you're doing fine.
Okay. So that's kind of where I see some very positive results from the union. Oftentimes people think it's a conflict, that they're opposed to each other, but they can be cooperative, and they are in certain parts of the state, and I think they tend to be if administration or corporations allow them to be.
And can you give us a history? After all, folks, he's almost 90 now, but can you give us a history of unions and labor, especially regarding the early 1900s and such people as let's say, Fighting Bob the Follett. I know he's one of your favorites. Or Eugene Debs. Maybe you'd like to talk about them for a bit.
Well, there was quite a bit of what some people, in a negative way, consider a socialist approach. But Bob La Follette was a liberal Republican, as we know, but he certainly brought about some great changes in Wisconsin. And other persons, as you say, Eugene Debs. And I remember the first socialist I heard speak was Norman Thomas, and he was speaking at a Methodist church in downtown Madison, and he brought up the whole issue of the moral responsibility of the employer. And to me, he presented what I would consider the Christian viewpoint, that we care for each other and we develop this sense of community and belonging. So that was a new thing for me. In fact, the first person I ever voted for in a presidential election was Norman Thomas, who ran for president 7 times, but never quite made it. But then the era of Joe McCarthy came along, where socialism got the same name as communism, and so it became a naughty word to a lot of people. And I'm sure that today most churches wouldn't invite a socialist to speak at their church, which is a loss.
Now, I understand that the early 20th century socialists, which you just mentioned, supported labor and unions.
Yes.
How did they do that? How did they do that? And weren't those socialists? It included people like Eugene Debs, as you mentioned, and of course Fighting Bob the Follett. But what exactly did they stand for, these big bad socialists?
Well, basically for basic needs of people, such as health care and workman's compensation, certain amount of time off, and safety in the workplace, which they didn't have. It was pretty much up to the employer to do what he darn well pleased.
Now, it also seems to me that these socialists and the unions fought for the 40-hour work week.
Yes, that's
weekends
correct.
off.
Yep.
The 8-hour day opposed to a 12-hour day.
That's correct.
Now, is that ringing some bells?
You bet.
Figuratively, that is?
Yeah. I remember I had 2 brothers. We were living in Chippewa when I was in high school. They worked at the White Manufacturing Company here in Eau Claire. Came down here every day for a 10-hour day, and they got paid 25 cents an hour. And that was back in the early to mid-30s.
Mm-hmm.
So I learned at that point that you had to work hard in order to make ends meet, but they still had trouble. They lived at home. That helped reduce the cost, but there was first-hand experiences, and with what I know about the tire company, it certainly was a benefactor to the employees eventually, because they were organized and well organized.
What about overtime? Because once the 40-hour week was established, didn't we have weren't the results overtime pay?
Well,
what do you know about that?
No, I don't know much about that.
Not much at all.
No.
But did you ever hear people like Eugene Debs or union leaders talk about overtime pay and getting weekends off?
Yeah, I remember visiting a friend of mine by the name of Uphoff, who he had 4 sons, and he named them all after certain social. Eugene Debs, Imhoff, and then Norman Thomas Imhoff. And we would gather at his house and talk about such matters as overtime pay, and what could be done to help the employees in a situation where it became unbearable to work such long hours, so many days.
And do you see any correlation today between unions and the middle class?
Very definitely. If the unions fade, so does the middle class shrink. It's just as true as the fact that I don't have a lot of hair on my head. And
really?
But
Really?
so we're seeing that all the time in the whole business of where 1% of the population receives the same amount of money as the other 99%. That does not make sense to me. That's not a democratic way or a community way of handling things. It's gotten to the point where it's a moral issue. Can you set up an autocracy because you got a lot of money? And that's more or less what's happening.
And let's see now, and I repeated that phrase that I hate saying, let's see now, so. But it just seems to me that rather than giving tax breaks to the wealthy and the super wealthy, perhaps it's best to give tax breaks, real tax breaks, to the middle class. Do you agree, and what is the advantage to that, if there is
I
one?
agree to that, to the point if they also tax the wealthy on a proportional way. Too oftentimes the wealthy get the breaks and the middle class don't have any breaks. So there needs to be an equalization there, at least. And I think what happens in some of the Scandinavian countries, such as Finland and Sweden, rather, by the way, I'm not Scandinavian, but I plug for the Scandinavian countries. So they have free education beyond high school if you're capable. They have mental health care and health insurance for everybody. They also have parental care. When you have a child, you can stay home for a little while to get used to the trauma of having a child and so forth. So they have these things built into their budget, and I don't hear anybody complaining. But more important is that people have a healthy outlook as far as community. We belong to a community, not we're fighting somebody all the time. So,
And this is sort of a repeat question, but I know you, and I think you'll take this in a different direction than what you previously did. But has the decline of unions brought about the decline of the middle class? And what have been the results of that decline?
Well, the result of it is more people are dependent upon assistance from either county or state level, because if you don't have enough money to spend or to meet the needs you have, then you're going to have to depend on somebody else. And we've seen great increases in dependency by people who are working full-time and sometimes holding 2 jobs or 3, and still they're not making ends meet. So that has to be corrected so that a person can work a good 8-hour day, 5 day a week, and have enough to live on. I remember my dad in about 34 or 33, he had his annual salary, and he was professional, was $2,800. And he had 6 boys and a wife. And we got along and appreciated it. But that was because we were seen as part of a community. But going back to your question, certainly a lot of people are hurting today, and we see that by the number of kids, for example, in the Eau Claire school system that are dependent on lunch, which is almost 1/2 of the population in some of the schools. So that means somebody's got a low income.
Now, I think we have 15 minutes left. Is that correct? Okay. Now, if people are making more money, doesn't that mean that they've got more money to spend for refrigerators and cars? Would you care to go into that a little bit?
Well, it works just the opposite way. If they don't have money, they're not going to buy cars. They're not going to buy appliances. They have to buy the essentials of living, mainly food and shelter. So it certainly affects, in the long run, the industry, and in a negative way. So it's kind of self-defeating. But with the rich getting richer, there's no way that, and the poor getting poorer, the middle class shrinking, you're going to have less and less purchasing of products.
And again, has the decline of unions brought about the decline of the middle class, and what do you see as a result of that?
Well, the results of we're having a tough time economically, and you know, it wasn't too long ago we had the big recession, and we're sort of on the edge of it all the time. As long as there's not money to purchase whatever's produced, and I fear that much of the industrialization is going overseas, which means less jobs, which means less money to buy locally. So that movement of jobs to other countries because it's cheap labor and labor that could not live on what they're paying for many of the foreign workers. So it's a self-defeating situation as far as the employers are concerned and the corporations, I believe. But it won't catch up to them until the middle class is completely gone.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Now you take a pretty strong interest in social services. As a matter of fact, you're a strong supporter of the Human Services Committee, Social Services Committee. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So you might know a thing or two about how declining wages have both the mother and the father working. Is that correct?
Sure.
And how does that affect mom, dad, and the kids?
There's just not the interaction with the family as much as it should be. If you're going to raise a family, you have to get involved with them. Otherwise, they're kind of raised by the community as whatever way they can be raised. And some of the responsibility of parents are being shifted to the school system. I know that a little bit because all three of my children are teachers, so they tell me some of the things they have to do that normally would be considered the responsibility of the family. The mom and pop don't have the time when they're working 8 hours a day just to survive. So it's affecting the family in the long run in a negative way.
So does that mean that you have high school kids and kids in junior high misbehaving and getting into trouble? Is that what's happening?
Well, I would say there's more peer pressure on kids if they don't have parental guidance.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been true throughout history. But I think it's more so when the parents are working and can't do anything else but to keep bread on the table and a roof over the head.
So that's what happened to Alexander the Great, huh?
Well, I don't know what Alexander.
You're not that old, are you, Bruce?
No, not quite.
Now, seriously, I've seen police officers in our high schools.
Sure.
Why are they there?
Partly because of what you just alluded to, mainly that some of the students don't have a line where they have to, follow the rules of the school. So there has to be someone who represents a positive factor in their life, and law enforcement can be real positive. If students see them as helpful in the community rather than a threat, I think it's very positive. So this starts at an early age. They recognize that the police are there for a good reason, mainly to associate in a positive way rather than in a negative way, as oftentimes is seen on the streets.
Now, we're not talking, I'm not being negative about the police. We need the police, period. But at the same time, if you've got police officers in our schools, this robs the community of more protection. True or false?
Well, if you neglect the community, sure, it's true. But I think we can afford both, and I think we ought to. You know, the whole matter of what you can afford is what you want to afford. It seems to me the first question any board or any responsible person is, what does the community need? That means both the school and the community as far as protection and guidance when there needs to be such. And it needs to have opportunities for people to move beyond high school in a positive way. But the cost of education nowadays is ridiculous. When I first was at the university after I was served in World War II, I was given the privilege of collecting fees for about a week. And when I started in 1947, the admission to the University of Wisconsin in Madison was $48 a semester for 18 credits. For in-state, $75 if you're out of state. Well, you know it's now in the thousands. But at that point, you could graduate without much of a debt. But as I mentioned, some countries, a number of countries, give free education if the person is capable. We ought to be doing the same. There's no sense in people having to graduate with a $40,000, $50,000 debt. And that's what's happening today. So we don't look at the future. We're just looking at the present. But that ought to be a primary step, in my opinion, to provide more education for more people if we're concerned about the future.
It's a great idea, but I'm wondering if the country can afford the overall costs. What do you think?
Sure they can. You know, we have this thing called the military budget, which is way, way out of line, in my opinion. You remember President Eisenhower warned of the industrial, rather the military-industrial complex. Mm-hmm. And now it's got to the point where you have to add the word corporation. In other words, it's just not industry, but the corporations who control industry. They're now part of the process of gobbling up way too much money. And so that's destroying our democracy, in my opinion, to the point where we're not living in a democracy. We're living in what I call a corpocracy, where the corporation is in charge. And so it's not government for the people, by the people, and of the people. Instead, it's government of the corporation, by the corporation, and by all means, opposite of what our original founding fathers thought was the valid approach to democracy.
Now, we have almost 5 minutes left.
Okay.
And that's not a lot of time. I've noticed that you've got a lot of notes here. Is there anything else you'd like to add? Is there anything there that you'd like to throw in?
Well, I think it's a moral issue that we're dealing with, not just an economic issue. In other words, if you're going to have a society where we respect each other and have a care for each other, it's a moral responsibility to provide that which is necessary to make an adequate living. And that often means that unions have to exist because sometimes corporations aren't willing to provide the money necessary for a fair living. So that basically, I'd like to say over and over again, this is a moral issue before us, and as such, it's also an issue as far as the future of democracy. We can't continue to go on like this, where the rich get ever richer and the middle class gradually dissipates and becomes part of the lower class. So that's kind of my conclusion, that we should be very concerned about morally and as far as our community of Eau Claire and the surrounding area is concerned.
Okay, is there anything else you'd like to add? Because I've seen you expound in private conversations.
Well, I think one thing we've got to be concerned about the environment, and of course one of my pets is the climate condition. And I think we ought to be thinking in Eau Claire, for an example, of 100 years, not 10. Most departments have to provide a 10-year plan. I think we ought to be thinking in a 100-year plan, and climate change is happening. And we ought to face the fact instead of burying our heads in the sand as one of the #1 issues for the country and for the world. Otherwise, we won't have it for our grandchildren and great-grandchildren.
Would you be surprised to learn that unions not only care very much about work safety rules. Now we're talking about the same
Yeah, I know.
rules, okay?
Yeah.
We've talked about this.
Yes, we did.
But they also care very much about the environment because they don't want their union members drinking polluted water or breathing polluted air. And would you be surprised to learn about that?
Well, if they
Come on now.
well,
Come on.
it's news to me, but they ought to be. They ought to be one of their primary concerns. And I think what the unions have to do in order to gain their good reputation is take some of these very vital issues as far as the future is concerned and bring them up and say, this is what we want to have in the next 50 to 100 years, and we'll do everything we can to bring a better environment to our people. That means that you slow down the carbon dioxide that goes into the system and all those other things we read about in the papers.
Well, this may come as a surprise to you, but unions are doing that. We are trying to get the word out about how we need to protect the environment. The problem you've got is that you've got the press, the media, that doesn't give the public that kind of coverage. It's pretty weak.
It is. And, of course, the union members are less, so there's not as much pressure as there used to be.
That's right.
So they have to get back where they're more influential because they have the right ideas. But if you don't have the numbers, it's sometimes difficult. So I think the public media has failed to bring about decent news reports. They're canned and oftentimes dictated by large corporations and dependent solely on advertising, where I'm a great believer in public education through the media, meaning television and radio.
Okay, that's today's program. My thanks to Bruce and, of course, to our viewing audience who always make Labor Talks possible. Remember, you can always contact your respective legislatures and let them know that you support community television. And remember, Labor Talks can also be seen on YouTube, so just Google YouTube and Labor Talks, and there we are. And Bruce, thank you very much.
Well, it's been a pleasure, and I appreciate the audience hanging with us and realizing that we all have ideas about the future, but I think we have to have that common concern of what's the environment going to be for the next generation.
Thank you, sir.
Glad that unions are getting behind it.
Chippewa Valley Community Television is made possible by continuing community support. If you would like to volunteer or make a donation, you can contact us by calling 715-839-5067 or on the web at www.cbctv.org.